The morning broke cold and colorless over Elm Hill, the kind of morning that settled into the bones and made a man feel older than he already was. Mist drifted like lost memories over the brittle ground, and Tom Bennett sat alone at his worn kitchen table, cradling a chipped mug of instant coffee. The house around him groaned with every gust of wind, the wood swollen and tired from years of neglect. It had once been a proud home, back when Tom and his wife, Mary, had filled it with laughter, with the smell of baking bread and the easy, endless chores of farm life. Now the rooms were hollow. Dust hung heavy in the corners, and photographs on the wall seemed to watch him with the patient sorrow of the long departed. Tom's mornings rarely differed. He would sip his weak coffee, pull on his heavy coat, and step out into the gray world to tend to the stubborn tasks that refused to die with the farm. A broken fence to patch, a sagging roof to mend, an apple tree to prune even though the apples no longer came. It was a life reduced to gestures, to honoring a routine that no longer served a purpose. The engine sound reached him before anything else, a low, throaty rumble that felt out of place in the stillness of the land. He frowned and set his cup down with a soft clink. No one ever drove up his road unless they were lost or selling something he couldn't afford. He moved to the window and pulled back the thin curtain with 2 fingers. Through the fog, he made out a shape, an old truck, its paint faded and peeling, crawling up the dirt driveway. As it drew closer, details sharpened, flags whipping against the cold breeze, hand-painted words across the side that read, Carter's Kitchen. The truck looked like it had survived a war, and maybe it had. It was a relic from another era, just like him. Steam billowed from a vented hatch near the back, carrying the unmistakable, heart-wrenching smell of food, real food. Not the thin broth or crackers he rationed, but the deep, rich aroma of fresh bread, seared meat, something sweet baking. Tom stiffened. His first instinct was suspicion. In his experience, nothing good ever came uninvited. He thought about retreating, letting the mist swallow him back into the silence of his house. But something stubborn, something older than fear, kept him frozen in place. The truck wheezed to a halt in the middle of his yard, sending a few curious crows flapping away from the broken fence. The driver's door creaked open and a tall figure emerged, a man in a grease-stained apron, his sleeves rolled up, his hair tucked under a battered baseball cap. He looked around with the easy confidence of someone who was used to making themselves at home in strange places. Behind him, more people spilled out. 2 young women unloading tables, a teenager struggling with a collapsible tent, an older man wrestling with a giant metal grill. Laughter floated through the cold morning, light and unguarded. They moved with purpose, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Tom watched them set up without saying a word, arms crossed tightly against his chest. His farm hadn't seen this much activity in years. Tents were erected near the apple trees, bright against the bare, claw-like branches. Long folding tables appeared, covered quickly with checkered cloths, laden with trays and boxes. The smells grew stronger, wrapping around Tom like an invisible hand. There was bread, fresh out of an oven, its crust crackling in the cool air. There were ribs smoking over the fire, the fat dripping and hissing. There was the heady perfume of apples and cinnamon and sugar, Mary's favorite scent. He tightened his jaw. His instincts told him to stay detached. These were young people, bright-eyed and full of plans, and he was a broken old man with little left to give. They'd be cheerful, polite, and eventually pitying. And he had no stomach left for pity. Yet he didn't move. The tall man, Vince Carter, though Tom didn't know it yet, spotted him standing on the porch and raised a hand in greeting. Tom gave a short, reluctant nod in return. Within minutes, the atmosphere of the farm changed completely. The dreariness of the morning was pushed back by the laughter, by the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. It was as if they were stitching something invisible back into the broken fabric of the place. Neighbors began to appear too, drawn by the scent and the commotion. Cars pulled into the rutted drive. People Tom hadn't seen in years, people he thought had forgotten him, stepped out, blinking curiously. Some held folding chairs under their arms. Some simply stood, hands in pockets, uncertain but unable to resist the call of something alive and warm in a world grown so cold. Tom remained on the porch, his hand resting lightly on the rough wood of the railing. The mist thinned around him, and in its place came a strange sense of expectation, like the air before a long-awaited rain. And there, amid the haze of wood smoke and the low hum of a generator, he glimpsed something even rarer than comfort: hope. It had not been invited. It had not been asked for. Yet it had come all the same, rattling up his driveway in a battered old truck, wrapped in the smell of apple pie and fresh bread. For the first time in years, Tom allowed himself to believe, just barely, that maybe the world had not entirely passed him by. Tom stayed rooted to the porch even as more neighbors arrived, weaving themselves into the strange gathering that was growing like wildflowers across the brittle grass. Some brought nothing more than wary glances, others came with hesitant smiles and offerings of casseroles wrapped in foil, old instincts of community awakening from long slumber. He noticed how the younger ones glanced at him, not with pity exactly, but with a kind of nervous reverence, like he was a monument they weren't sure they were allowed to approach. Behind the bustle, the tall man from the truck worked quietly, organizing platters, stirring pots, adjusting the battered old grills with a craftsman's precision. Every movement suggested someone who knew not just how to feed bodies, but how to feed something deeper. It wasn't until one of the women with him, a dark-haired woman with a clipboard and a determined stride, approached the porch that Tom's curiosity overcame his suspicion. She carried something cradled carefully in her arms, a long, narrow box wrapped in worn brown paper. Her face held none of the easy cheer the others wore. Instead, there was something steady and solemn in her expression, something that matched the quiet spaces inside Tom that he rarely let others glimpse. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Tom inclined his head slightly. He didn't trust himself to speak. She set the box down on the porch steps with great care, as if placing a crown on an altar. "My name is Mia," she said. "I'm part of Carter's kitchen." She paused, searching for the right words. "We found something that belongs to you." Tom stared at the box. His chest tightened, and for a terrible moment, he thought of Mary again, of the box that had held her final possessions, sent home from the hospital in a cruel, efficient plastic tub. With slow, deliberate movements, he knelt, joints protesting, and unwrapped the package. Inside, nestled against faded blue velvet, were his medals. The silver star, the purple heart, the campaign ribbons, even the small, battered pocket Bible he'd carried through frozen valleys in Korea, all there, arranged with heartbreaking precision. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He ran his gnarled fingers over the medals, each one a reminder of a past life so distant it felt like another man's story. He thought he'd lost them forever. When the bills mounted and the house grew colder and smaller with every passing winter, he had taken the medals to a pawn shop in town. There had been no other way to pay for insulin, no other way to keep the lights on for just one more month. At the time, he told himself it didn't matter. That the things that truly mattered, Mary's laugh, the faces of the men he'd served with, the feel of the earth under his boots, lived in memory, not in metal and cloth. But standing there now, with the medals glinting weakly under the gray light, he realized how wrong he had been. It mattered. It had always mattered. He looked up at Mia, bewildered. "How?" he managed to rasp, his voice rough from disuse. Mia knelt beside him, the clipboard forgotten on the steps. "One of our team. Vince's manager, actually, found the silver star listed in an online auction. It wasn't even described properly, just veteran's medal, old, but she knew it was important. She bought it immediately. Then we tracked the serial number and the service records." She hesitated, a strange softness crossing her features. "And that's when we realized who you are." Tom blinked. He wasn't anyone. Not anymore. Mia smiled slightly, as if she could read the disbelief in his mind. "Vince's grandfather, Joe Carter," she said, "served in Korea too. He used to tell stories about a sergeant who saved his unit during an ambush in the Valley of Frozen Hills. Dragged wounded men through snow and fire. Stayed behind until the last man was safe." Tom stared at her, unmoving. Mia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a creased photograph. She handed it to him carefully. It was black and white, the faces grainy but unmistakable, a group of young soldiers in heavy coats, helmets crooked over boyish faces, standing stiffly before a battered tank. Near the center, slightly taller than the others, was Tom. The years fell away in a rush, the farm, the loneliness, the debt, all dissolving like mist. He remembered that day. He remembered the way the cold had burned his lungs, the way his boots had frozen to the ground. He remembered laughter that sounded like hope, even when hope seemed impossible. Joe Carter had been there. A scrawny kid with a busted rifle and a grin too wide for his face. Tom's hand shook as he handed the photo back. "You saved his life, Mr. Bennett," Mia said quietly. "Vince grew up hearing about you. About the man who didn't run, who didn't leave anyone behind." Tom tried to speak but found he couldn't. His throat was too tight, his heart too full. Mia stood up and dusted off her jeans, as if giving him time to gather himself. "Vince wanted to thank you in person," she said. "And he thought it was time you got these back." Tom swallowed hard, one hand resting protectively over the medals as if afraid they might vanish if he let them go. The bustling sounds of the gathering drifted back into his awareness, pots clanging, children laughing, the sizzle of meat on open grills. Life happening around him, not away from him. It had been so long since Tom Bennett had been part of anything that he almost didn't know how to step back in. But the warmth of the box in his hands, the weight of the medals against his chest, and the kindness etched in Mia's face anchored him to the moment. It was not the past he was holding on to now. It was the bridge back to something he thought he had lost forever. The noon sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds, casting a muted light over the farmyard that buzzed now with life. Children darted between the apple trees, chasing each other with paper flags in their hands. The scent of roasted pork and fresh pies hung thick in the cool air, clinging to jackets and laughter alike. Tom Bennett stood at the edge of it all, his medals clutched to his chest as if they were a life raft. He felt a strange dizziness, not from hunger or fatigue, but from the overwhelming tide of it, the sudden crashing return of a world that had forgotten his name for so long. It would have been easy to retreat into the safety of the house, to shut the door and the memories with it. But something deeper kept him rooted to the ground, something that stirred beneath the layers of loneliness and stubborn pride. He spotted Vince Carter among the crowd. Even without the apron, even without the busy workers orbiting him like planets around a sun, Vince would have been easy to pick out. There was a weight to him, a presence that couldn't be hidden behind a smile or a casual handshake. Vince caught his eye and crossed the yard with a slow, deliberate pace, a man approaching something sacred. In his hands, he carried not a gift, not a medal, but a folded American flag, the kind usually reserved for ceremonies that ended in salutes and tears. But this one wasn't draped over a coffin. It was crisp, alive, held with reverence for the living man who still stood to receive it. When he reached Tom, Vince bowed his head slightly in greeting, a silent acknowledgement from one soldier to another. No words passed between them for a long moment. Only the crackling of the fire pits and the distant strains of a guitar filled the space. Vince finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "My grandfather owed you his life," he said. "If it weren't for you, he wouldn't have come home. I wouldn't be standing here today." Tom swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. He wanted to say it was nothing. That it had been just another day in the hell that was Korea. That he'd only done what any man should have done. But the words refused to come. Maybe because deep down, he had never fully believed it himself. Vince shifted the flag under his arm and pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket. He handed it to Tom carefully, as if passing something fragile. Tom hesitated before opening it. Inside was a contract, simple, clear, unpretentious, and a check with a figure that made his knees wobble. $12,000. Enough to fix the cracked windows, the leaking roof, the sagging barn. Enough to breathe again without counting every dollar like a precious grain of wheat. Tom looked up, bewildered. Vince smiled, a little sheepishly. "We're launching a project," he explained. "Veteran Cuisines. It's a series about traditional meals, old recipes, the stories behind them. We travel, we record, we feed people. We honor where we came from. He pointed back toward the makeshift kitchen bustling with energy. "We want you to be a part of it. Teach the young ones a few things. About farming. About survival. About living with your hands and your heart." Tom stared at him, stunned. It was too much. It was too generous. It was too impossible. But Vince wasn't finished. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a second envelope. Smaller. Handwritten. "This," he said, "is from my grandfather." Tom opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in a careful, unsteady script. "Dear Tom, if you're reading this, it means the debt I owed has finally come full circle. You saved my life when others would have left me behind. You carried me when I could not walk. You fed me when you had nothing yourself. I never forgot you. I told my grandson about the man who didn't just fight for his country, he fought for the man beside him. I told him that real heroes don't wear capes. They wear mud and blood and stubbornness. They carry others even when their own legs give out. Thank you, Sergeant Bennett. Thank you for giving me the chance to live my life, to love my wife, to see my children grow up. If he can do anything for you now, please let him. Let him carry you a little, the way you once carried me. You deserve it. Always your brother in arms. Joe Carter." Tom gripped the letter until the edges crumpled. His vision blurred, but he refused to let the tears fall. "Not here. Not yet." Vince clapped a hand gently on his shoulder, the briefest touch of strength and understanding. "And," Vince added, his voice catching slightly, "we're rebuilding your greenhouse too. Found some folks in town who remember how much your wife loved it. They volunteered." Tom turned his head sharply, as if the blow had been physical. He had almost forgotten the little greenhouse. Mary's sanctuary. Her cathedral of tomatoes, sunflowers, and basil. He had sealed it up after she died, unable to bear the sight of her gardening gloves still hanging by the door. Vince mistook the movement for doubt. "You don't have to say yes now," he said quickly. "You can think about it. But either way, the renovation's a gift. No strings attached." The weight of the morning, of the years of loss and loneliness, pressed down on Tom until he thought he might buckle. But then he looked around, really looked. Neighbors he had not spoken to in years were laughing, clapping each other on the back, eating shoulder to shoulder at the long tables. Children he didn't know chased each other around the old oak tree, shrieking with laughter. And in the center of it all stood his old house, battered but still standing, surrounded by something it hadn't felt in decades, hope. Tom closed the envelope slowly, tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket where it pressed against his heart. Maybe it was pride that kept him from speaking. Maybe it was gratitude too big for words. But when he extended his hand to Vince and gripped it tightly, it said everything he needed to say. He wasn't being rescued. He was being restored. The sun was sinking low behind the hills, painting the sky in soft strokes of amber and violet. The light strung between the apple trees blinked to life, casting a warm, golden net over the farmyard. Long tables sagged under the weight of empty pie tins and picked-over platters. Laughter, thick and unhurried, drifted up into the cooling evening air. Tom Bennett stood quietly near the old oak tree, watching the life unfolding around him. His medals now hung proudly on his chest, polished by the light, no longer hidden or pawned away in the silent desperation of hunger. Children ran barefoot across the grass. Elderly neighbors clapped along to the band tuning up near the porch. A world that had seemed to retreat from him for so many years was here again, vibrant and beating at his doorstep. And then the mayor arrived. Mayor Judith Langston, a stern woman whose name Tom only ever heard during election seasons, stepped carefully through the crowd, flanked by 2 members of the town council. She wore a practical navy blazer and carried a heavy, official-looking folder under her arm. It was the kind of approach Tom had learned long ago to mistrust. Officials rarely came bearing anything but trouble. But Judith's face bore none of the usual brittle smiles of politics. Instead, she looked almost humbled, like someone coming to pay a debt long overdue. She approached Tom directly, the crowd parting around her as if sensing the weight of the moment. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to hush the nearby chatter. "I think it's time we officially recognize what this place means to Elm Hill." Tom frowned, and used to ceremony. Judith opened the folder and produced a certificate, thick paper embossed with the town seal. She held it out with both hands, an offering. "In honor of your service to your country," she said, "and in recognition of your years of dedication to this community, we are moving to designate your farm a protected historical site. It will be preserved for future generations, a living testament to endurance, to sacrifice, and to the quiet kind of heroism that too often goes unnoticed." There was a ripple through the crowd, a low murmur of approval, of wonder. Tom took the certificate carefully, reading the words through misted eyes. For so long, he had lived as if he were fading. As if the world had already written the final chapter of his story. And now, here it was, a new beginning inked into the very soil he had once thought would bury him. Judith wasn't finished. She reached into her bag once more and pulled out a plaque. Bronze, heavy, simple. Bennett Farm, home of Sergeant Thomas Bennett. Defender, farmer, neighbor. A place where hope took root and never died. The words blurred as Tom stared at them. Not from the failing twilight, but from the rush of emotion rising so fast it threatened to break him in two. Behind him, he felt the weight of the moment settle over the gathering. The same men and women who had once looked away from him at the grocery store, who had crossed the street rather than confront the sadness clinging to him like a worn coat, now stood in respectful silence. Even the ones who had whispered about the farm's decay, who had wondered when the old man would finally give up and move to a state home, were here, heads bowed slightly, the language of regret etched into the lines of their faces. Vince stepped forward and pressed something small and cool into Tom's hand. It was a coin, a military challenge coin, simple but heavy with meaning. On one side, the American flag. On the other, an inscription. "For the one who stayed behind to carry others forward." Tom closed his hand around it. It wasn't just a coin. It was a promise. A bridge. A way forward. He didn't speak. There were no speeches that could have captured it anyway. Instead, he lifted the plaque high for all to see. A quiet gesture. A final, wordless salute. The crowd erupted in applause, not polite, not formal, but thunderous and real, rolling over the fields like a summer storm. It broke something inside Tom and rebuilt it all at once. That night, long after the last slice of pie had been eaten, after the last tent had been folded and the last car engine had faded into the distance, Tom sat alone on the front porch, a blanket draped over his knees. Above him, the stars hung low and thick, as if even the heavens were leaning closer to bear witness. Inside the house, the photographs of Mary smiled back at him from the mantel. The medals gleamed once more, newly honored. And beside them, a new photograph, Tom standing among the neighbors who had come back to him, Vince by his side, children at his feet, and hope, real, solid hope, draped across his shoulders like an old, familiar jacket. The house felt full again. Not with things, but with life. Tom took the coin from his pocket and turned it over thoughtfully between his fingers. He thought about the years of silence, the loneliness, the feeling of being forgotten. And then he thought about the old army truck, the smell of apple pie on the breeze, the children's laughter threading through the broken orchard. He realized that kindness, the simple, stubborn, unglamorous kind, had circled back to him in a way he could never have orchestrated or earned. It had been enough to keep doing good, even when no one saw. It was enough. It had always been enough. He smiled into the night, the kind of smile that comes when a burden finally lifts and you remember who you are. Kindness without question is enough.